somewhere off the coast of a forgotten island, beneath the roots of an old oak tree, a wooden chest is said to be waiting. Inside it, gold doubloons, strands of pearl, silver bars stamped with the marks of a vanished empire. For 300 years, this image has lived in the human imagination with a kind of stubborn, glittering permanence. A skull and crossbones flag snapping in the wind, a folded map, its edges burned with a single red X marking the spot. A one-eyed captain pacing the deck of his ship, already dreaming of the day he will return to dig up his fortune. It is one of the most beloved stories we tell ourselves. And it is, almost entirely, a myth. This is not to say pirates did not exist. They very much did, and their lives were every bit as dramatic as the legends suggest, though rarely in the ways we imagine. The so-called Golden Age of piracy, roughly spanning the late 1600s to the early 1700s, produced real men and women who terrorized shipping lanes from the Caribbean to the coast of Madagascar. Names like Blackbeard, Captain Kidd, Calico Jack Rackham, and Anne Bonny were not inventions of later storytellers. They were flesh and blood, hunted by navies, feared by merchants, and eventually, in most cases, caught and hanged. But the treasure chest, sealed shut and sunk into a hidden patch of sand, marked only by a map passed from hand to hand. That particular detail belongs almost entirely to fiction. So where did this image come from, if not from history itself? The answer, somewhat surprisingly, traces back to a single book. In 1883, a Scottish novelist named Robert Louis Stevenson published a story called Treasure Island. It featured a one-legged sea cook, a parrot perched on his shoulder, a map with an X, and a buried fortune waiting to be claimed. The novel was an immediate sensation, and its imagery proved so vivid, so satisfying, that it quietly rewrote the public's understanding of what pirates actually did. Before Stevenson, pirates were understood as violent opportunists who spent their plunder almost as quickly as they stole it. After Stevenson, they became treasure hunters with secrets buried in the earth, waiting patiently for a hero to come find them. Fiction, in this case, did not just reflect history, it replaced it. Before we continue, if these stories have become part of your nights, consider subscribing to the channel as we prepare another story for you. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the story. The truth of what pirates actually did with their riches is, in some ways, far more human than the legend. Most pirate crews operated under surprisingly democratic systems, dividing their plunder among the crew almost immediately after a successful raid. According to shares agreed upon before the voyage even began, a captain might take 1.5 shares, a quartermaster slightly less, an ordinary sailor a single share, but the gold rarely sat still long enough to be buried. It was spent, often within days, in the port towns that lived off piracy's strange economy. Nassau in the Bahamas, Port Royal in Jamaica, and Saint-Marie off the coast of Madagascar became famous not for hidden caches in the sand, but for taverns, brothels, and gambling houses where fortunes vanished as quickly as they were won. A pirate's life, after all, was rarely a long one. Why save for a future that disease, storms, or the gallows would likely never allow you to see? And yet, the myth is not built on pure invention. There is, tucked into this story, one extraordinary exception. A single documented case that may have given the entire legend its foothold in reality. A man named Captain William Kidd, in the final desperate weeks before his arrest in 1699, did indeed bury treasure, real treasure, on Gardiner's Island off the coast of Long Island, New York. He hoped it might serve as a bargaining chip to save his life. It did not. He was tried and hanged in London the following year, and his buried gold was dug up by colonial authorities and used as evidence against him at trial. One true story, dramatic enough to capture the public's imagination, was enough. From that single isolated act of desperation, an entire mythology grew. In the segments ahead, we will follow this story to its furthest corners. We will explore the real pirates behind the legends, the islands rumored to hold impossible fortunes, the treasure hunts that consumed lifetimes and fortunes of their own, and the rare, astonishing cases where lost gold actually was found. We will ask why this myth has endured so powerfully across centuries, and what it tells us about the way we long for mystery in a world that so often resists it. So settle in. The tide is calm tonight, and there is a long story ahead of us. To understand why the treasure myth took such powerful root in our imagination, we first need to understand the people who supposedly buried it. And here is where history becomes far stranger and far more interesting than the legend it inspired. The pirates of the so-called Golden Age were not romantic outlaws drifting alone across the sea with a single loyal crew and a heart of gold beneath their cruelty. They were, in most cases, desperate men shaped by an economic system that had very little use for them once it was finished with them. Consider the world that produced piracy in the first place. By the late 17th century, European navies had grown enormous, swollen by decades of war between England, France, Spain, and the Netherlands. Sailors were recruited by the tens of thousands, trained in the brutal discipline of naval life, and then, the moment a war ended, discarded almost overnight. A peace treaty signed in some distant European capital meant immediate unemployment for thousands of trained seamen scattered across colonial ports with no pension, no severance, and often no way home. Merchant shipping could absorb some of them, but merchant captains paid poorly and disciplined harshly, sometimes withholding wages entirely for infractions as small as falling ill. For a certain kind of man, hardened by war and embittered by exploitation, piracy began to look less like a crime and more like a correction, a way of taking back, by force, what the legitimate economy had refused to give. This context matters enormously, because it explains something the legend never quite captures. Pirate ships were, in their own rough way, some of the most democratic institutions of their era. Long before revolutions reshaped the political landscape of the Atlantic world, pirate crews were electing their captains by vote, and could depose them by vote as well, the moment a captain proved cowardly or incompetent. Quartermasters, not captains, often held the real day-to-day authority aboard ship, mediating disputes and overseeing the fair distribution of plunder. Many crews operated under written codes, often called articles, which every man was required to sign before a voyage began. These articles laid out, with surprising precision, how spoils would be divided, what compensation a man would receive if he lost an eye or a limb in battle, and what punishments awaited those who stole from their fellow crew members or abandoned ship during a fight. It was, in essence, an early form of workers' compensation, drafted by men the legitimate world considered criminals. Bartholomew Roberts, known to his contemporaries as Black Bart, captured perhaps more ships than any pirate in history, somewhere in the range of 400 vessels, during a career that lasted only a few short years. His articles, which survive in historical record, forbid gambling aboard ship, required lights to be extinguished by 8 in the evening, and mandated that any dispute between crew members be settled on land with pistol and sword, rather than aboard the close quarters of the ship itself. He himself, by most accounts, never drank alcohol, preferring tea, and ran his ship with a discipline that would have impressed many a naval commander. He died in 1722 in a battle off the coast of West Africa, struck through the throat by grape shot while still standing on deck in his finest clothes, having reportedly said that a short, merry life was better than a long, miserable one. There was no treasure chest waiting for him. His crew, in something close to grief, weighted his body and committed it to the sea before the approaching Navy ship could claim it as a trophy. Then there is Edward Teach, the man history remembers as Blackbeard, whose reputation looms so large that it has nearly swallowed the actual historical figure whole. He commanded a fleet rather than a single ship, blockaded the entire port of Charleston, South Carolina, for nearly a week in 1718, and cultivated a terrifying personal image that involved tying lit fuses into his beard, so that he appeared, in the smoke and candlelight of a captured vessel, to be something closer to a demon than a man. Yet for all his fearsome reputation, surviving records suggest Blackbeard rarely killed unnecessarily. His power came from intimidation rather than slaughter, from the careful cultivation of a myth that made resistance seem pointless before a single shot was fired. He met his end in November of 1718, in a brutal close-quarters battle against a Royal Navy lieutenant named Robert Maynard, sustaining, according to accounts from the period, more than 20 sword wounds and 5 gunshot wounds before he finally fell. His head was removed and hung from the bowsprit of Maynard's sloop as proof of his death, and as a warning to any sailor who might consider following his path. No map was found among his possessions. No hidden fortune was ever recovered. Whatever wealth he had accumulated had, in all likelihood, already been spent, gambled, or distributed among his crew long before that final battle. The women of this era deserve particular attention because their stories complicate the popular image of piracy as an exclusively male pursuit. Anne Bonny and Mary Read sailed together aboard Calico Jack Rackham's ship, both disguising themselves at various points as men, both fighting by multiple accounts with a ferocity that startled even hardened sailors. When their ship was finally captured in 1720, it was reportedly Bonny and Read who continued fighting on deck after most of the male crew had retreated below, too intoxicated or too frightened to resist. Both women were sentenced to hang alongside their captain, and both escaped that fate, at least temporarily, by revealing they were pregnant. Mary Read died in prison, likely of fever, before she could be executed. Anne Bonny's fate remains genuinely uncertain. Some records suggest she was eventually released and quietly disappeared from history. Others claim her father, a wealthy planter, paid for her freedom. The historical trail simply goes cold, leaving us with one of piracy's truly unsolved mysteries. Though notably, it is not a mystery involving buried gold. What unites nearly all of these figures, the captains and the crews, the famous and the forgotten, is the basic economic reality of their profession. Pirate ships were not slow accumulations of wealth, hoarded carefully across a long and patient career. They were fast, violent, and short-lived enterprises. A successful raid might yield enormous sums, sometimes worth millions in modern currency, but that wealth needed to move quickly, both because pirates rarely trusted one another with unequal shares for long, and because a pirate's life expectancy after taking up the trade was measured, often, in mere months or a handful of years. The combination of disease, violence, storms at sea, and the ever-present threat of capture and execution meant that very few pirates were thinking in terms of retirement. They were thinking in terms of survival and pleasure, and the next port where their gold could buy them food, drink, and a brief illusion of freedom. This is precisely why the ports of piracy became as legendary as the pirates themselves. Nassau, in the years before 1718, operated almost entirely outside any formal government, a town where former pirates set their own rough rules, and merchants openly traded looted goods without fear of prosecution. Port Royal in Jamaica had earned, by the late 17th century, a reputation as one of the most hedonistic cities in the Western world, a place where, as it was sometimes said by visitors of the period, sailors could spend in a single night what had taken them months of danger to acquire. Even Madagascar's eastern coast hosted pirate communities, substantial enough that some historians have debated whether early settlements there resembled small, semi-organized states, complete with their own informal codes of governance. None of these places needed buried treasure. They were where the treasure went to disappear, spent on rum, women, gambling, and the kind of momentary luxury that men who expected to die young found impossible to resist. And so we begin to see the shape of the truth beneath the legend. The pirates were real, their violence was real, their democratic shipboard codes and their astonishing individual stories were real. But the patient, careful burial of treasure, set aside for some imagined future, runs almost entirely against the grain of how these men and women actually lived and thought. They were creatures of the immediate, shaped by lives too short and too uncertain to plan very far ahead, which makes the exception we mentioned earlier, the one true case of a pirate captain burying his fortune in desperation rather than design, all the more remarkable. In our next segment, we will return to that singular story, the case of Captain William Kidd, and trace exactly how one man's desperate gamble in 1699 became the seed from which an entire mythology would eventually grow. Every great myth needs a kernel of truth, something real enough to anchor the imagination, something that allows the impossible to feel merely improbable. For the legend of buried pirate treasure, that kernel is a single man and a single desperate decision made over the course of a few weeks in the summer of 1699. His name was William Kidd, and unlike nearly every other figure we have discussed so far, he did not begin his career as an outlaw. He began it, somewhat ironically, as one of the law's own instruments. Kidd was born in Scotland sometime around 1654, the son of a Presbyterian minister, and by the 1690s had established himself as a respected sea captain in New York, a man of property, married to a wealthy widow, comfortable enough in society to count colonial governors among his acquaintances. This respectability matters, because it shaped everything that followed. In 1696, a group of powerful English investors, including several prominent members of Parliament and, by some accounts, even King William III himself operating through intermediaries, commissioned Kidd to sail as a privateer. His mission was twofold, and, on paper, entirely legal. He was to hunt down pirates operating in the Indian Ocean, and he was to seize French shipping, since England and France were at war at the time. A privateer, it is worth pausing to explain, was not technically a pirate at all. He carried a letter of marque, a government document granting legal permission to attack and plunder enemy vessels, with the understanding that a share of the proceeds would flow back to the Crown and to his investors. It was piracy with paperwork, violence sanctioned by the state, and many of history's most celebrated naval officers had built careers on exactly this kind of legally sanctioned plunder. Kidd set sail aboard the Adventure Galley, a purpose-built vessel of considerable speed, and the early signs were not promising. His crew, recruited partly from the rough taverns of New York, grew restless when month after month passed without a single profitable capture. Tensions aboard ship mounted to the point of mutiny. In one infamous incident in October of 1697, Kidd struck a gunner named William Moore with a wooden bucket during an argument, fracturing his skull. Moore died the following day. This act alone, a captain killing a member of his own crew, would later be used against Kidd with devastating effect, though at the time such violence aboard ship, while serious, was not entirely unprecedented in maintaining discipline at sea. Desperate for the success his investors demanded, and facing a crew on the edge of rebellion, Kidd's conduct grew increasingly difficult to distinguish from outright piracy. In early 1698, he captured a vessel called the Quedagh Merchant, an enormous prize loaded with satins, silks, gold, and other valuable cargo. The ship was flying French colors and carrying French passes, which under the terms of Kidd's commission made the seizure entirely legal. But the ship itself was owned by Indian merchants, and more critically, by interests connected to the Mughal Empire, one of the most powerful and lucrative trading partners England possessed in the region. The seizure caused a diplomatic crisis. The East India Company, whose profits depended enormously on maintaining good relations with Mughal authorities, demanded that England take action against Kidd, and quickly. What had been a legally sanctioned act of war was, almost overnight, recast as an act of piracy, because the political costs of calling it anything else had become too high for the men who had once funded him. By the time Kidd learned that he had been formally declared a pirate, with warrants issued for his arrest across the English colonies, he was sailing back toward the Caribbean, almost certainly unaware of just how thoroughly his reputation had been destroyed in his absence. When he finally received word of his situation, likely sometime in the spring of 1699, he made a decision that would echo across the next 3 centuries of popular imagination. Rather than simply fleeing into permanent exile, which many genuine pirates of the era chose to do, Kidd believed, perhaps naively, that he could clear his name. He believed that if he could present his French passes, the documents that proved his seizure of the Quedar merchant had been technically legal, to the right people in the right manner, he might yet escape the gallows. It was this belief, this fragile hope of vindication, rather than any criminal cunning, that led him to bury his treasure. Sailing north along the American coast in the early summer of 1699, Kidd stopped at Gardiner's Island, a small piece of land off the eastern tip of Long Island owned by a prominent colonial family. There, according to testimony later given at his trial, Kidd buried a portion of his accumulated wealth, gold, silver, jewels, and fine cloth, in the ground, asking the island's owner, John Gardiner, to safeguard the location and reveal it only under specific circumstances. This was not, it is worth emphasizing, an act of greed or an attempt to hide his fortune from authorities forever. It was, by most historical interpretation, a kind of insurance policy. Kidd intended to use the treasure as a bargaining chip, perhaps as evidence of his good faith, perhaps simply as a reserve he could draw upon depending on how his legal situation unfolded, while he sailed onward to negotiate with the one man he believed might still protect him, Richard Coote, the Earl of Bellamont, governor of New York and Massachusetts, and not coincidentally, one of the original investors who had funded Kidd's voyage in the first place. The meeting did not go as Kidd hoped. Bellamont, facing his own political pressures from London and eager to distance himself from any association with a man now branded a pirate, had Kidd arrested almost immediately upon his arrival in Boston in July of 1699. Word was sent to Gardiner's Island, and colonial authorities recovered the buried treasure, valued at the time at roughly £14,000, an enormous sum, equivalent to several $1 million in modern terms. Far from serving as Kidd's salvation, this recovered gold became Exhibit A in the case against him, tangible proof displayed before judges and crowds that he had indeed accumulated wealth through piracy. Kidd was shipped to London in chains, held for over a year awaiting trial, much of it in the notoriously brutal conditions of Newgate Prison. His trial in May of 1700 was, by most modern historical assessment, something closer to a political execution than a fair legal proceeding. The French passes that might have proven his actions legal under the terms of his original commission were mysteriously unavailable at trial, supposedly lost in transit, though they would resurface centuries later in British archives, long after they could do Kidd any good. He was convicted both of piracy and of the murder of William Moore, the gunner he had struck with the bucket years earlier. On the 23rd of May, 1700, William Kidd was hanged at Execution Dock along the Thames. In a detail almost too grimly theatrical to be believed, the first rope used in his execution snapped under his weight, and he had to be hanged a second time before he finally died. His body was afterward coated in tar and suspended in a metal cage over the river at Tilbury Point, left on public display for years as a warning to other sailors who might consider following his path. Here, then, is the truth at the heart of the legend. One man driven not by the patient accumulation of a criminal fortune but by a desperate and ultimately futile attempt to save his own life. Buried treasure in the earth. And that treasure was found almost immediately by the very authorities he had hoped to appease. There was no decades-long mystery. No map changed hands in secret. No fortune sat waiting, undiscovered, for generations of treasure hunters to dream about. And yet, somehow, this single, well-documented, thoroughly unromantic episode became the seed from which an entire mythology would grow. Word of kids' buried gold spread quickly through colonial society and then across the Atlantic, transformed and exaggerated with each retelling, until the story shed its inconvenient details, the diplomatic crisis, the desperate legal strategy, the immediate recovery by colonial officials, and kept only its most evocative image, a pirate captain burying gold in secret on a lonely stretch of American coastline. By the time Robert Louis Stevenson sat down to write Treasure Island nearly 2 centuries later, the figure of Captain Kidd had already become something closer to folklore than history. His name attached to rumored treasure sites scattered along the Atlantic coast from Nova Scotia to the Carolinas, almost none of which had any genuine connection to the man himself. Stevenson's novel did not invent the idea of buried pirate gold. It simply gave that idea its definitive shape, distilled from a century and a half of accumulated rumor descending from one man's brief, failed gamble for his own survival. In our next segment, we will follow those rumors to their most famous destination, a small, unassuming island off the coast of Nova Scotia, where for more than 200 years, treasure hunters have poured fortunes, and in some tragic cases their very lives, into the search for something that may never have existed at all. If Captain Kidd's brief, desperate gamble planted the seed of the buried treasure myth, then Oak Island is where that seed grew into something far larger and far stranger than anyone could have anticipated. Tucked into Mahoney Bay, off the southern coast of Nova Scotia, Oak Island is a modest piece of land, roughly 140 acres, covered in the red oak trees that gave it its name. By almost any ordinary measure, it should be unremarkable. Instead, it has become the site of what may be the longest, most expensive, and most thoroughly inconclusive treasure hunt in recorded history. A search that has now stretched across more than 2 centuries, consumed multiple fortunes, and claimed at least 6 lives. The story, as it is most commonly told, begins in 1795, when a teenage boy named Daniel McGinnis was exploring the island and came across a curious depression in the ground beneath an old oak tree, its branches showing signs of having once supported a pulley or tackle system. Intrigued, McGinnis returned with 2 friends, John Smith and Anthony Vaughan, and the 3 began to dig. What they found, according to the accounts passed down through generations of island lore, was a shaft lined with carefully laid flagstones, descending into the earth with a platform of logs every 10 feet. They dug down some 30 feet before abandoning the effort, lacking the resources and equipment to continue, but convinced, utterly convinced, that something valuable lay below, deliberately concealed by whoever had constructed this elaborate shaft. It would be nearly a decade before serious excavation resumed, this time under a company formed specifically for the purpose, and it was during these later efforts, sometime around 1803 and 1804, that the legend acquired its most enduring and chilling detail. As diggers descended further into what came to be known as the Money Pit, they reportedly discovered a series of inscribed stones, layers of charcoal, putty, and coconut fiber at regular intervals, materials notably foreign to the Nova Scotia coastline and suggestive to those searching of deliberate construction by someone who had traveled from far warmer climates. At around 90 feet, diggers claimed to discover a stone bearing a cryptic inscription, which one translation, of dubious scholarly origin, rendered as a message indicating that 40 feet below lay £2 million. Whether this stone ever truly existed in the form later described, or whether it represents an embellishment added decades after the fact, remains one of the unresolved questions at the very center of the Oak Island mystery. The original stone itself was eventually lost, reportedly used as part of a fireplace hearth in a nearby home, before vanishing from historical record entirely, leaving researchers with second-hand descriptions rather than physical evidence. What happened next set the pattern that would repeat itself with tragic regularity for the next 200 years. As diggers pushed deeper, the pit began to flood, seawater pouring in through what investigators came to believe was a deliberately engineered system of flood tunnels connected to the nearby shore and designed specifically to defeat anyone attempting to reach the bottom without first disabling the mechanism. Pumps of the era proved hopelessly inadequate against the volume of water. Successive excavation companies across the entire 19th century and into the 20th attempted increasingly elaborate methods, cofferdams, new shafts dug alongside the original, in hopes of intercepting and blocking the flood tunnels, ever more powerful pumps, all to similarly frustrating effect. Money flowed into the island in quantities that, across the decades, likely far exceeded the value of any treasure the pit could plausibly contain, even under the most generous estimates. The human cost mounted alongside the financial one. In 1897, a worker named Maynard Kaiser fell to his death from a hoisting platform. In 1965, 4 men, including Robert Restall and his teenage son Robert Jr., died after being overcome by toxic gas that had accumulated in one of the excavation shafts, a tragedy that briefly drew national attention to the island and its strange, persistent allure. As recently as 2004, the search claimed yet another life. Each new generation of treasure hunters has approached the island convinced that modern technology, ground-penetrating radar, advanced drilling equipment, sonar mapping of underground voids would finally succeed where earlier, cruder methods had failed. Each generation has, so far, been disappointed, though not without occasionally uncovering tantalizing fragments, pieces of wood, scraps of what some have identified as parchment, even, in later expeditions, what investigators described as possible human bone fragments, none of which have provided anything resembling definitive proof of treasure or even definitive proof of the pit's original purpose. This is perhaps the central irony of Oak Island, and one worth sitting with for a moment. For more than 2 centuries, an enormous amount of human ingenuity, capital, and in the most tragic cases, human life, has been devoted to solving a mystery whose very existence remains genuinely uncertain among serious historians and geologists. A number of researchers have proposed an explanation considerably less romantic than buried pirate gold, that the original depression discovered by Daniel McGuinness in 1795 was not a man-made shaft at all, but a natural sinkhole, common to the limestone and gypsum geology found throughout this part of Nova Scotia, where underground water erosion frequently creates exactly the kind of cavities and exactly the kind of unpredictable, engineered-seeming flooding that excavators have struggled against for generations. Under this interpretation, the flood tunnels were never built by smugglers or pirates seeking to protect their hoard, but are simply natural channels through porous limestone bedrock, connecting the pit to the surrounding sea entirely without human design. And yet the theories proposing human construction and deliberate concealment have never entirely lost their hold on public imagination, partly because the alternative explanations have never been definitively proven either. Some researchers have speculated that the pit might contain treasure connected not to piracy at all, but to British military payroll, hidden during the American Revolutionary War. Others have proposed, with considerably less evidentiary support, connections to Marie Antoinette's lost jewels, supposedly smuggled out of France during the Revolution, or even, in the most elaborate and least substantiated theories, manuscripts belonging to Francis Bacon, or treasure connected to the Knights Templar. None of these theories rest on anything approaching solid historical documentation. They persist instead because the pit itself, regardless of its origin, possesses a genuine and well-documented structural complexity that resists easy dismissal. The layered platforms, the apparent flood mechanism, details that, whatever their true origin, certainly do not resemble an ordinary sinkhole to the casual observer, however much the geological evidence might suggest otherwise. The most recent excavations, conducted under considerable media attention through television documentation beginning in the 2010s and continuing into recent years, have employed genuinely sophisticated modern techniques, yet have, by the most recent reporting, still not produced anything that could be definitively called treasure. What they have produced, repeatedly, are fragments interesting enough to sustain hope without ever quite delivering resolution. This pattern, tantalizing partial evidence followed by frustrating inconclusiveness, has proven remarkably durable, sustaining over 200 years of continuous fascination in a way that a simple, definitive discovery, or a simple, definitive debunking, likely never could have. There is something almost perfectly calibrated about Oak Island's mystery, persistent enough to never quite die, elusive enough to never quite be solved. Perhaps this is, in the end, the truest lesson Oak Island has to teach us about the broader pirate treasure myth as a whole. We are not merely searching for gold when we dig into stories like this one. We are searching for the particular pleasure of an unsolved mystery, for the possibility that the world still contains a few genuine secrets hidden just beneath the surface, waiting for the right combination of patience and persistence to bring them to light. In our next segment, we will turn from this enduring uncertainty towards something more concrete, the handful of cases across history where treasure connected to piracy, shipwrecks, and lost fortunes actually was found, recovered from the ocean floor and from the historical record alike, and what these genuine discoveries can teach us about separating the myth from the reality at last. For all the digging, all the speculation, all the centuries of fruitless excavation on islands like Oak Island, it would be a mistake to conclude that treasure connected to piracy and lost shipping has never actually been recovered. It has, on several remarkable occasions, and the true stories of these recoveries are, in their own way, every bit as compelling as the myths that surround them, though they tend to involve considerably more patience, considerably more scientific rigor, and considerably less drama than the legends would suggest. The treasure, when it was finally found, was almost never buried beneath an oak tree behind a cryptic stone marker. It was far more often scattered across the ocean floor, the result not of careful concealment, but of catastrophe. A ship driven onto rocks by a storm, or sent to the bottom in battle, its cargo left undisturbed for centuries, simply because no one had yet developed the means to reach it. Consider the story of the Wider Galley, a ship whose recovery, more than any other discovery of the 20th century, finally provided something archaeologists had never possessed before: physical, undeniable proof connecting a shipwreck directly to a specific, named pirate. The Wider had begun her life as a slave ship, built in London in 1715 for the brutal triangular trade that connected Europe, West Africa, and the Americas. In February of 1717, she was captured by the pirate captain Samuel Bellamy, known to his contemporaries as Black Sam, who converted her into his flagship and outfitted her with as many as 28 cannons, making her one of the most formidably armed pirate vessels of her era. Bellamy's career as a pirate captain, though brief, had been extraordinarily lucrative. By most estimates, his crew had captured more than 50 ships in barely a year of raiding, accumulating a fortune that, by some calculations, may have rivaled or exceeded that of any other pirate of the Golden Age. That fortune went down with the ship. In April of 1707, sailing along the coast of Cape Cod, the Wider was caught in a violent nor'easter, driven onto a sandbar, and broken apart by the pounding surf within sight of shore. Bellamy himself drowned, along with all but 2 of his roughly 146 crew members, and the wreck, along with whatever fortune remained aboard her, settled into the shifting sands off what is now Wellfleet, Massachusetts, where it lay essentially undisturbed for more than 2.5 centuries. It was not until 1984 that an underwater explorer named Barry Clifford, after years of painstaking research through colonial shipping records and survivor testimony, finally located the wreck beneath the sand. What followed was not the swift, triumphant recovery of popular imagination, but a slow, methodical excavation that has, remarkably, continued in various forms into the present day, decades after the initial discovery. Divers have recovered tens of thousands of artifacts from the site, including coins from numerous nations, reflecting the truly international nature of pirate plunder, cannons, navigational instruments, and perhaps most significantly, a ship's bell cast with the words, "The Wydau Galley 1716, providing the kind of definitive, unambiguous identification that treasure hunters searching sites like Oak Island could only dream of possessing. The Wydau remains, to this day, the only fully authenticated pirate shipwreck ever discovered and excavated, a distinction that makes it genuinely unique among all the sites we have discussed so far. A second remarkable case, though it involves treasure fleets rather than pirates themselves, deserves attention here for what it reveals about the genuine scale of historical lost wealth and the extraordinary effort sometimes required to recover it. In 1622, a Spanish treasure ship named Nuestra Señora de Atocha, part of a fleet carrying silver, gold, and emeralds mined and processed across Spain's American colonies, was caught in a hurricane near the Florida Keys and sank with virtually her entire cargo intact. For more than 350 years, the Atocha's location remained unknown, despite numerous attempts to find her, until a treasure hunter named Mel Fisher, after a search that consumed 16 years of his life, exhausted his finances repeatedly, and tragically claimed the lives of his own son and daughter-in-law in a 1975 diving accident, finally located the main wreck site in July of 1985. The recovery that followed yielded an almost unbelievable haul: gold bars, silver ingots, thousands of silver coins, and emeralds valued, in total, at somewhere between $400 and $450 million in modern currency, making it one of the most valuable shipwreck recoveries in history. What these two stories share, beyond their genuine historical significance, is a pattern worth noting carefully, because it stands in such stark contrast to the buried treasure myth we have been examining throughout this documentary. In both cases, the treasure was not hidden by design. It was lost by accident, claimed by storms and shipwreck, rather than concealed by careful human intention. In both cases, recovery required not a lucky encounter with an old map, but years, sometimes decades, of dedicated archival research, technical innovation, and in Fisher's case, profound personal sacrifice and financial risk that very few people could have sustained. And in both cases, the treasure, once found, did not belong neatly to its discoverers. Years of legal disputes followed both recoveries. Questions of ownership contested between treasure hunters, state governments, and, in the Atocha's case, all the way to the United States Supreme Court, which in 1982 ultimately ruled in Fisher's favor, establishing important legal precedent regarding the rights of those who locate and recover historic shipwrecks in international waters. There is, woven through both of these stories, a quieter truth about real treasure recovery that the popular myth tends to obscure entirely. The line between archaeology and treasure hunting is considerably more contested and considerably more ethically complicated than adventure stories generally acknowledge. Professional archaeologists have frequently criticized commercial treasure recovery operations, even successful and well-documented ones like Clifford's work on the Wydau, for prioritizing the recovery of valuable artifacts over the careful, painstaking documentation of archaeological context that allows historians to fully understand how a site came to exist in the first place. The tension between treasure as financial windfall and treasure as historical record, between the diver hoping to fund his next expedition and the historian hoping to understand a vanished world, runs through nearly every genuine shipwreck recovery in ways the old myths, with their simple chests of gold waiting patiently underground, never had to grapple with. What emerges then from these true stories of recovered treasure is something considerably more nuanced than the legend that inspired centuries of digging on islands like Oak Island. Real treasure has indeed been found, and in quantities that occasionally rival the wildest imaginings of fiction, but it has been found through scientific patience rather than romantic adventure, through years of archival research and technological innovation, rather than the discovery of a conveniently preserved map, and through catastrophe and accident rather than deliberate concealment. The ocean floor, it turns out, holds far more genuine pirate and colonial treasure than any patch of buried earth ever has, simply because ships sank far more often than pirates ever bothered to dig holes. We have traveled a long way across this story, from the desperate gamble of a single sea captain on Gardiner's Island to the flooded depths of a pit in Nova Scotia, from the genuine wreckage of a converted slave ship off Cape Cod to the silver-laden hold of a Spanish galleon resting for centuries beneath the waters of the Florida Keys. And now, having traced the myth back through its sources, separating the documented history from the embellishment, the genuine recovery from the enduring uncertainty, we arrive at perhaps the most interesting question of all, not whether the treasure is real, because by now we understand the answer is far more complicated than a simple yes or no. The more interesting question is why we have needed this story so badly, for so long, regardless of what the evidence actually shows. Consider, first, just how thoroughly this myth has outlived the historical period that supposedly produced it. The golden age of piracy lasted, by most historical accounting, scarcely more than 30 years, drawing to its effective close in the early 1720s as European navies, having finally redirected wartime resources toward hunting pirates rather than fighting one another, systematically dismantled the pirate strongholds of Nassau and Madagascar, and hanged or imprisoned most of the era's most notorious captains. And yet the cultural fascination with piracy, far from fading alongside its historical reality, has only intensified across the 3 centuries since. Stevenson's Treasure Island, published more than a century and a half after Blackbeard's death, sparked not a brief revival of interest, but an entirely new mythology that continues generating books, films, theme park attractions, and television documentaries to this very day. There is something worth sitting with in that timeline. We have now spent vastly more time mythologizing piracy than piracy itself ever actually existed. Part of the answer, I think, lies in what the pirate represents within the broader structure of how we tell stories about freedom and constraint. The historical pirates we examined earlier in this documentary were, in reality, men shaped by exploitation, desperation, and the brutal economics of an era that offered very few genuine alternatives to violence for sailors discarded by naval and merchant fleets alike. But the mythologized pirate, the figure that emerged through Stevenson and through the centuries of romanticized retelling that followed him, represents something almost entirely opposite. A figure who has stepped outside the constraints of ordinary society entirely, who answers to no government, no employer, no fixed address, who lives by a code of his own choosing rather than one imposed upon him. The buried treasure within this mythology serves a very specific symbolic function. It is not merely wealth, it is proof that a life lived outside society's rules can still produce something of permanent value, hidden away, waiting, secure from the taxation and confiscation and ordinary economic struggle that defines life within the system the pirate has rejected. We are not, in other words, simply fascinated by gold. We are fascinated by the idea of a fortune that belongs entirely and irrevocably to the person who found it, free from every claim the ordinary world might otherwise place upon it. This helps explain, too, why the myth has proven so much more durable than the historical reality it loosely springs from. History is, by its nature, finished. We know how Blackbeard died, how Bellamy's ship broke apart on a Cape Cod sandbar, how Kidd's gold was dug up within weeks of his own arrest. These stories, however dramatic, have reached their conclusions. And conclusions, however satisfying, eventually exhaust their capacity to hold our attention. The buried treasure myth, by contrast, remains permanently, deliberately unfinished. Oak Island's money pit has resisted definitive resolution for more than 2 centuries, precisely because it has never been fully solved, and that unsolved quality is not an unfortunate gap in the story. It is, in a very real sense, the entire point. A mystery that has been solved becomes simply a historical fact, interesting but inert. A mystery that remains genuinely open invites every person who encounters it to imagine themselves as the one who might finally crack it, the one whose careful research or lucky discovery might succeed where 2 centuries of predecessors failed. This is an invitation that finished history simply cannot offer. There is also, I think, something worth acknowledging about what this myth reveals concerning our relationship with the natural landscape itself. The buried treasure story requires a particular kind of geography, islands and coastlines and forgotten stretches of shore that appear, on the surface, entirely ordinary, indistinguishable from countless other patches of land, yet secretly contain something extraordinary beneath their unremarkable exterior. This is, perhaps, a deeply comforting idea, more comforting than we often acknowledge. It suggests that the world has not been fully mapped, fully catalogued, fully drained of its capacity to surprise us. In an era when satellite imagery can resolve detail on the ground from hundreds of miles above the Earth, when nearly every physical space on the planet has been photographed, measured, and indexed into some digital database, the notion that an ordinary island off the coast of Nova Scotia might still harbor a genuine, unsolved secret carries a particular kind of emotional weight. It pushes back, gently, but persistently, against the sense that mystery itself has become an increasingly scarce resource in the modern world. And yet, even as we acknowledge the genuine emotional and cultural function this myth serves, it is worth returning, one final time, to what the actual historical and archaeological record tells us. Because the truth, properly understood, is not a disappointment so much as a different kind of satisfaction entirely. The real pirates, men like Bartholomew Roberts running his ship under strict written codes, women like Anne Bonny and Mary Read fighting alongside men who had abandoned the fight around them, Blackbeard cultivating an image of terror that substituted for the violence he largely avoided, were genuinely remarkable figures, full of contradiction and complexity, deserving of fascination entirely on their own historical merits, without any need for invented treasure maps to make their stories compelling. Captain Kidd's actual buried gold, recovered within weeks by the very authorities he had hoped to appease, offers a story not of triumphant discovery, but of profound human desperation. A man gambling everything on a legal strategy that never had any real chance of succeeding, which is, in its own way, a far more poignant story than any tale of forgotten riches waiting patiently underground. And the genuine treasures that have been recovered, the widest bell rising from the sands off Cape Cod, the Atocha's emeralds and silver bars pulled from waters where they had rested for 3.5 centuries, remind us that when extraordinary wealth truly was lost to history, it was almost always claimed not by careful concealment, but by catastrophe, and recovered not through luck but through years, sometimes decades, of patient, disciplined, often heartbreaking human effort. The story we have followed so far, from Kidd's gold to Oak Island's pit to the wrecks of the Whydah and the Atocha, represents only the most thoroughly documented thread of a much larger tapestry. Scattered across the world, other legends of lost and buried wealth have taken root in the centuries since the golden age of piracy, each one borrowing from the same basic emotional architecture, A hidden fortune, a coded clue, a place ordinary enough to seem unremarkable, yet somehow chosen to guard something extraordinary. A few of these stories deserve our attention here, not because they resolve any differently than the cases we have already examined, but because together they reveal just how durable and how endlessly adaptable this particular shape of myth has proven to be. Consider the treasure of Lima, perhaps the single most famous unrecovered treasure legend in the world, and one that has consumed even more excavation effort across more locations than Oak Island itself. The story dates to 1820, during the turbulent years of Peru's struggle for independence from Spain. As rebel forces closed in on Lima, the city's Spanish colonial authorities, fearing the capture of the church's accumulated wealth, gold statues, jeweled crucifixes, ceremonial objects accumulated across nearly 3 centuries of colonial rule, reportedly entrusted this treasure to a British sea captain named William Thompson for safekeeping, intending to ship it to Mexico for protection. Thompson, according to the legend, instead murdered the Spanish officials sent to guard the cargo and sailed for Cocos Island, an isolated, uninhabited volcanic outcrop roughly 340 miles off the coast of Costa Rica, where he buried the treasure and scattered his crew to the winds. Thompson himself was later captured by Spanish authorities and reportedly offered his life in exchange for leading them back to the treasure, only to escape into the island's dense jungle the moment he was released to guide the search, vanishing from history entirely. Whether any part of this story is literally true remains genuinely uncertain, much as it does with so many treasure legends of this era, but the consequences of believing it have been very real indeed. Cocos Island has drawn an almost unbroken stream of treasure hunters since the mid-19th century, by some estimates more than 500 separate expeditions, including, reportedly, one organized in the 1930s with backing from German engineer August Gisler, who spent nearly 2 decades of his life searching the island, and found, by most accounts, only a small handful of coins, nowhere near the vast fortune the legend promised. Even Franklin Delano Roosevelt, during his time as a private citizen, is said to have visited the island in pursuit of the legend aboard his own yacht. The island's reputation grew substantial enough that Costa Rica eventually declared it a national park, in part to curb the environmental damage caused by generations of amateur excavators digging indiscriminately across its protected terrain. To this day, no treasure connected to the Lima legend has ever been authenticated, and most serious historians regard the story as likely embellished, well beyond whatever its original kernel of truth might have contained. Yet the expeditions have never entirely stopped. A rather different kind of treasure mystery emerges from the so-called Beale ciphers, a set of 3 encoded documents first published in an 1885 pamphlet, which purportedly describe a fortune in gold, silver, and jewels buried in Bedford County, Virginia, sometime in the early 1820s by a man named Thomas Jefferson Beale. According to the pamphlet's account, Beale had discovered the treasure while leading an expedition in the American West, transported it back to Virginia for safekeeping, and left behind 3 coded messages, one supposedly describing the treasure's exact location, one detailing its contents, and one listing the names of the men entitled to share in it, before vanishing without ever returning to claim his fortune. Of the 3 ciphers, only the second has ever been successfully decoded, using the United States Declaration of Independence as a key text, and it does indeed describe an enormous buried fortune. The first and third ciphers, containing the location and the names, have resisted every decoding attempt across more than a century of effort by cryptographers, mathematicians, and amateur enthusiasts alike. This unsolved quality has made the Beale ciphers a subject of particular fascination within the cryptography community specifically, distinct from the broader treasure hunting culture surrounding sites like Oak Island, precisely because the mystery here is intellectual as much as physical. Many cryptographic historians now suspect the entire pamphlet may have been an elaborate hoax, possibly even constructed by the pamphlet's own publisher to drive sales, since no documentary evidence of Thomas Jefferson Beale himself has ever been found in any contemporary historical record, and yet the ciphers continue to circulate, continue to be studied, continue to generate the same mixture of hope and frustration that defines nearly every story in this documentary. Not every treasure story ends in permanent uncertainty, however, and one of the more remarkable recent developments in this field offers a useful counterpoint to the unresolved legends we have just discussed. In 2015, the Colombian government announced the discovery of the wreck of the San Jose, a Spanish galleon sunk by British warships in 1708, while carrying an extraordinary cargo of gold, silver, and emeralds back from the Americas to fund Spain's war effort in Europe. The ship's cargo, accumulated from across Spain's colonial holdings in present-day Peru and Colombia, has been estimated by some assessments at a value exceeding several $billion, making it potentially one of the most valuable shipwrecks ever located anywhere in the world. Unlike the legends of Cocos Island or Bedford County, the San Jose's existence and approximate sinking location had never been seriously in doubt among historians. What had been missing for 3 centuries was simply the precise location of the wreck itself, lying at a depth of roughly 2,000 feet, far beyond the reach of any diver or excavation technology available until quite recently. The discovery has, predictably, sparked extensive legal disputes between the Colombian government, which claims the wreck as a matter of national patrimony, the Spanish government, which asserts historical ownership rights over a vessel that sailed under the Spanish crown, and a private salvage company that claims to have located the wreck decades earlier under a different agreement entirely. As of the most recent reporting, the treasure itself remains where it sank, untouched on the ocean floor, its fate still being negotiated in courtrooms rather than recovered by any expedition, a reminder that even when a treasure's existence and location are no longer genuinely in question, the question of who actually gets to claim it can prove just as difficult to resolve as the original mystery ever was. What strikes me, looking across all of these cases together, is how persistently the same emotional pattern reasserts itself, regardless of century or geography. A modern echo of this exact pattern emerged as recently as 2010, when an art dealer and author named Forrest Fenn announced he had hidden a bronze chest filled with gold and jewels somewhere in the Rocky Mountains, accompanied only by a poem containing 9 clues to its location, in what he described as an attempt to draw people outdoors during difficult economic times. The search that followed consumed a full decade, drew hundreds of thousands of searchers from across the world, and tragically claimed at least 5 lives among those who ventured into dangerous wilderness terrain in pursuit of the chest, before a Michigan medical student named Jack Stewart finally located it in Wyoming in June of 2020. What makes Fenn's treasure so revealing for our purposes is precisely that it was deliberately, consciously constructed using the exact architecture of the older legends. The coded clue, the patient wait, the ordinary landscape concealing something extraordinary, suggesting that this particular emotional structure has become something close to a permanent fixture of how we imagine the relationship between mystery, landscape, and reward, available now to be consciously built rather than merely inherited from history. The myth, it seems, has become not just a story we tell about the past, but a template we continue, quite deliberately, to build new stories upon. Before we close this documentary, it is worth pausing on something we have circled around throughout every segment so far, without ever quite addressing it directly. The buried treasure chest is not the only invention layered onto the historical record of piracy. It is, in fact, only the most prominent member of an entire collection of images, sounds, and behaviors that the popular imagination has come to associate with pirates, almost none of which bear much resemblance to how these men and women actually lived, spoke, or fought. Understanding where these other myths came from helps complete the picture we have been building, because it reveals something important. The entire aesthetic of piracy as we know it today was assembled gradually, across more than 2 centuries, by writers, filmmakers, and entertainers who were not so much documenting history as constructing an entirely new mythology from a handful of scattered, often unrelated historical fragments. Take, for instance, Walking the Plank, perhaps the single most iconic image of pirate cruelty in the popular imagination. The condemned prisoner forced at sword point along a wooden board extending out over the ship's rail, taking those final steps toward the waiting sea below. It is a remarkably cinematic image, and it appears to be almost entirely fictional. Historical and legal records from the golden age of piracy contain virtually no documented instances of this particular method of execution. Pirates who wished to kill a captured sailor or a mutinous crew member had far more direct and far less theatrical methods available to them. Simple execution by gun or blade, or the considerably crueler but historically documented practice of marooning, abandoning a man alone on a deserted island or sandbar with minimal supplies, left to face starvation, thirst, or madness in isolation, rather than a quick death by drowning. The plank-walking image appears to have emerged primarily from 19th century popular fiction, gaining particular traction through illustrated adventure stories published decades after actual piracy had ended, where artists and writers found the slow, suspenseful walk toward the sea considerably more dramatically satisfying to depict than the swift, unglamorous violence that more accurately characterized pirate brutality. The eye patch and peg leg, similarly, owe more to literary convenience than historical documentation. It is true that injuries were common among sailors of this era, given the violence of naval combat and the primitive state of medical treatment available aboard ship, and it is entirely plausible that some pirates did indeed lose an eye or a limb in the course of their work. But the eye patch as a defining pirate accessory appears to trace back specifically to a single influential source, Israel Hands, a supporting character in Stevenson's Treasure Island, whose description included exactly this detail, and whose vivid presence in that enormously popular novel helped cement the eye patch as visual shorthand for piracy in the public imagination ever since. Long John Silver's wooden leg, similarly drawn from Stevenson's pages, performed the same function, transforming what may have been a plausible but unremarkable injury into an instantly recognizable symbol. Interestingly, some historians have suggested an alternative, more practical explanation for the eye patch myth: the theory that sailors moving between the bright sunlight on deck and the darkness below decks during combat may have worn a patch over one eye specifically to keep that eye adjusted to darkness, allowing for quicker vision when descending into a dim hold during battle. This theory, while clever, has never been definitively documented in any historical pirate account from the actual Golden Age, and most historians regard it as a modern rationalization, constructed after the fact to explain an already established myth rather than a genuine historical practice. Even the parrot perched dutifully on a pirate's shoulder, an image so thoroughly embedded in popular culture that it requires almost no explanation, traces back to the very same novel. Stevenson gave Long John Silver a parrot named Captain Flint, and the image proved so memorable, so visually distinctive, that it became permanently fused with the broader pirate aesthetic in the decades that followed, despite the practical reality that keeping a live bird aboard a working sailing vessel amid storms, combat, and the general chaos of pirate life would have been considerably more impractical than charming. There is some genuine historical basis for sailors of this general era, acquiring exotic birds, monkeys, and other animals during voyages to tropical regions, intending to sell them upon return to European ports. But the specific image of a permanently shoulder-perched companion parrot appears to be, once again, primarily Stevenson's invention, absorbed so completely into popular culture that most people today would likely be surprised to learn it originated from a single 19th century novel, rather than any genuine historical pattern. The Jolly Roger itself, that iconic black flag bearing a white skull and crossbones, does have considerably more genuine historical grounding than the myths we have just discussed, though even here the popular image simplifies a far more varied historical reality. Pirate flags during the actual Golden Age varied enormously from captain to captain, functioning less as a single standardized symbol and more as a kind of personal brand, each captain designing his own variation intended to maximize psychological terror among potential victims. Blackbeard's flag, by most historical reconstruction, depicted a skeleton holding an hourglass in one hand and a spear piercing a bleeding heart in the other, a considerably more elaborate and specific image than the generic skull and crossbones most people associate with piracy today. Bartholomew Roberts flew multiple different flags over the course of his career, including one depicting himself standing triumphantly atop two skulls, labeled with the initials of Barbados and Martinique, a deliberately personal taunt directed at the colonial governments of those two islands that had been particularly aggressive in pursuing him. The black flag itself functioned, in practice, as a kind of negotiating signal, raised to warn a targeted ship that immediate surrender would result in mercy, while a red flag, flown in some pirate traditions, signaled the opposite, that no quarter would be given regardless of whether the target chose to fight or surrender. The skull and crossbones design did exist during this period, but as one variation among many, rather than the universal symbol it has since become in popular imagination, a simplification that occurred gradually as later illustrators and storytellers gravitated toward the most visually striking and easily reproducible version among the many genuine historical designs. Even the distinctive pirate accent itself, that rolling, exaggerated ara, so thoroughly associated with piracy that an entire unofficial holiday now celebrates it each September, has a traceable and surprisingly recent origin. Historical pirates, drawn from the general population of English, French, Dutch, and other European sailors of the era, would have spoken with whatever regional accent matched their actual origins, with no particular unified pirate dialect existing at all. The exaggerated West Country English accent now associated with piracy traces specifically to a single performance, actor Robert Newton's portrayal of Long John Silver in the 1950 film adaptation of Treasure Island, whose theatrical rolling delivery of the role proved so memorable and so widely imitated in subsequent pirate-themed entertainment that it effectively created an entirely new linguistic stereotype from a single mid-20th century acting choice layered atop a character who was, once again, Stevenson's invention from nearly 7 decades earlier. What this collection of myths reveals, taken together, is something genuinely fascinating about how cultural memory actually works. We tend to imagine that our understanding of historical periods gradually accumulates and refines itself over time, growing more accurate as scholarship advances and primary sources are more carefully examined. But the case of piracy suggests something closer to the opposite pattern. A handful of vivid, emotionally satisfying details: the buried map, the eye patch, the parrot, the rolling accent, originating from a small number of enormously influential creative works produced well after the historical period itself had ended, gradually crowded out the considerably more mundane, more varied, and in many ways more genuinely interesting historical reality, until the fiction became, for most people, simply indistinguishable from the history it had originally drawn loose inspiration from. The treasure chest beneath the oak tree is not an isolated myth. It is part of an entire constructed world, built piece by piece across 2 centuries of storytelling, that has, by now, almost entirely replaced our cultural memory of what piracy actually was. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over the historical record, once a myth has been examined closely enough to see its seams, the threads where invention was stitched onto fact, where a novelist's convenient detail hardened into accepted truth, where one man's desperate gamble became, over centuries of retelling, an entire genre of buried fortune. We have spent this documentary pulling at those seams, gently, without any particular wish to diminish the wonder of the story, only to understand it more completely. And now, having traced the myth from its origins through its most famous sites, its rare genuine confirmations, and its persistent variations across the centuries, it seems fitting to close not with another mystery, but with a quieter consideration of what remains once the digging is finished. It is worth noting first just how much of an actual economy has grown up around this myth, separate entirely from whatever treasure may or may not still be waiting in the ground. Nassau, once the lawless pirate haven we discussed earlier in this documentary, now derives a meaningful portion of its tourism revenue from precisely the history that made it notorious: museums, guided walking tours, and reconstructed pirate attractions drawing visitors eager to stand where Blackbeard and his contemporaries once walked. Port Royal, the Jamaican port that earned its reputation for hedonism and excess in the late 17th century, sank partially beneath the sea during a catastrophic earthquake in 1692, and the submerged ruins have since become a genuine site of serious underwater archaeological study, drawing researchers interested not in treasure but in the remarkably well-preserved architectural and material record of a vanished colonial city, frozen in place by disaster rather than buried by intention. Oak Island itself, regardless of whether its money pit ever yields definitive treasure, has generated, by most estimates, considerably more economic value through tourism, media licensing, and related commerce than any plausible treasure the pit could reasonably contain. A fact that places the entire centuries-long excavation effort in a slightly different light. The myth, it turns out, has become its own kind of treasure, one that pays out reliably to those who tell the story well, regardless of what does or does not lie beneath the ground. This economic afterlife raises an interesting question about how modern societies have chosen to regulate the treasure hunting that the myth continues to inspire. The legal disputes surrounding the Atocha and the San Jose, which we discussed in earlier segments, were not isolated incidents, but symptoms of a broader, ongoing tension in international law concerning who actually owns the wealth of the past. In 2001, UNESCO adopted the Convention on the Protection of the Underwater Cultural Heritage, an international agreement reflecting a significant shift in how the archaeological community has come to view shipwreck recovery. Rather than treating sunken ships as simple salvage, available to whoever locates and recovers them first, the convention establishes a strong preference for preserving wrecks in place, treating them as archaeological sites to be studied carefully and protected, rather than treasure troves to be extracted and sold. This represents, in many ways, a formal institutional rejection of exactly the impulse that has driven treasure hunters from the earliest excavators of Oak Island through Mel Fisher's 16-year pursuit of the Atocha. The impulse to view sunken history primarily as wealth waiting to be claimed, rather than as a fragile, irreplaceable record of the past deserving careful, patient study. Not every nation has ratified the convention, and considerable tension persists between commercial salvage operations, sovereign governments, and the academic archaeological community. But the trend across the past several decades has moved steadily toward treating these sites with the same protective seriousness applied to terrestrial archaeological excavations, a meaningful departure from the treasure hunting ethos that defined recovery efforts throughout most of the 20th century. And yet, for all this institutional caution, the emotional pull of the original myth has shown remarkably little sign of weakening. If anything, each new generation seems to discover its own version of the same basic story, reshaped to fit contemporary sensibilities but recognizably built from the same components we have traced throughout this documentary. Forrest Fenn's deliberately constructed treasure hunt, which we examined in our previous segment, demonstrated that the appetite for this particular kind of mystery remains entirely undiminished by 3 centuries of accumulated skepticism, debunking, and historical correction. People did not need to believe that pirates truly buried treasure beneath ancient oak trees in order to spend a full decade combing the Rocky Mountains in pursuit of a bronze chest hidden by a contemporary art dealer. They needed only the underlying emotional architecture, the hidden reward, the coded clue, the patient landscape concealing something extraordinary, regardless of whether that architecture traced back to genuine 17th century history or to a 21st century marketing campaign disguised as philanthropy. This suggests something worth sitting with as we bring this documentary toward its close. The myth of buried treasure may never have been primarily about pirates at all. Pirates simply provided one particularly vivid historical costume for a much older, much more fundamental human appetite, the desire for a world that still contains genuine secrets, accessible to anyone patient and clever enough to find them, regardless of birth, wealth, or station. There is, perhaps, something quietly reassuring in recognizing this distinction. If the appetite for hidden treasure predates and outlasts the specific historical figures we have spent so much of this documentary examining, then the eventual resolution of any single mystery, the final excavation of Oak Island's money pit, the decoding of the remaining Beale ciphers, the recovery of the San Jose's cargo from the ocean floor off Colombia, will not actually extinguish this deeper human need. New mysteries will continue to emerge, deliberately constructed or genuinely accidental, to take their place. This is not a cynical observation so much as a hopeful one. It suggests that our fascination with figures like Blackbeard, Captain Kidd, and Bartholomew Roberts was never really a fascination with their gold at all, however much the myth insisted otherwise. It was a fascination with the particular shape of their freedom, brief and dangerous and ultimately fatal for nearly all of them, and with the possibility, however remote, that something of lasting value might still be found by those willing to look carefully enough at the ordinary, overlooked corners of the world. So we return, in the end, to where this documentary began: a wooden chest, a folded map, a red X marking some forgotten patch of coastline. We now understand that this image, however beloved, however thoroughly woven into our collective imagination, owes far more to a 19th century Scottish novelist's narrative instincts than to the actual lived experience of the pirates who supposedly buried it. We understand that the real pirates spent their plunder almost as quickly as they acquired it, that their genuine democratic codes and astonishing individual stories deserve fascination entirely on their own historical merits, and that the rare moments when treasure truly was lost and later found involved catastrophe and patient scientific recovery rather than careful concealment and lucky discovery. We understand, too, that the myth has proven remarkably adaptable, generating new variations across centuries, continents, and mediums, from Cocos Island to Bedford County to the Rocky Mountains, each iteration reshaping the same essential elements to fit its own particular moment in history. What we're left with, ultimately, is not a treasure map, but something considerably more durable. A clearer understanding of why this particular story has refused to fade, regardless of how thoroughly its individual details have been examined and, in most cases, gently dismantled. The tide moves in and out along these coastlines, as it always has, indifferent to whatever lies buried or lost beneath the sand and the waves. But we, unlike the tide, remain stubbornly, persistently drawn back to these shores, again and again, in search of something we suspect, on some level we may never actually find, and continue searching anyway, because the searching itself, it turns out, was always the larger part of the treasure. Thank you for spending this time with the story. May your own search, whatever shape it takes, bring you exactly the kind of quiet satisfaction this one has tried, in its own way, to offer you tonight.